Welcome everyone to this introductory session of the two-day long India Counter Dialogue on the United Nations Food System Summit. In 2019, the United Nations Secretary General announced that the UN Food Systems, or the UNFSS, will be held to transform the way the world produces, consumes, and thinks about food, putting the focus on realizing the Sustainable Development Goals. The UNFSS is scheduled to be held on 23rd September 2021. However, the UNFSS has garnered criticism for the control exercised by corporate lobbies, agribusinesses, think tanks, and big philanthropic organizations in driving the agenda of the summit. The course of the summit has been permeated with corporate influence to drive shifts in global food governance that threaten food sovereignty and security for large sections of marginalized and vulnerable populations. Accountability and multilateralism have been the centerpiece of the global food governance structure under the UN bodies since the post-Second World War period. Slowly and steadily, as nations gained independence, the concerns of the developing world started to gain traction, and the developed world was made accountable for its act in these international spaces. Over the years, there have also been reforms within the FAO and UN Committee for World Food Security to bring in more democratic engagements in opposition to the workings of the WTO, IMF, and other institutions of the new globalization era. However, with the UNFSS, there seems to be a dismantling of the democratic global governance order. Shalmali Guttal is the Executive Director of Focus on the Global South. She has been actively working, researching, and writing on issues of development, food sovereignty, trade and investments, and global governance for over 25 years. She has worked extensively in the Mekong region and Southeast Asia, and also India. She is considered a close ally by the peasant organizations and groups working within the CSM. Shalmali has been an active member of the International Civil Society Network, which has been tracking the UNFSS and facilitating a global counter-mobilization against it. She will be providing a critical overview of the UNFSS and cover aspects about its inception, background, structure, functioning, motivation, and future. So I welcome Shal.
Now, the origin of the summit, well, it was announced, on World Food Day on October 16th in 2019. And I think, as Michael pointed out, that was just a few months after the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Amina Mohammed, and Chair of the United Nations Sustainable Development Group signed this strategic partnership with the World Economic Forum. Now, whether the idea came from the World Economic Forum or not, we can't say. I mean, we don't actually have proof of that. But when we look at who's involved in the UNFSS, the Food Summit, the System Summit, it's very clear that corporations are centrally involved in shaping the content, process, participation, participants and outcomes of the summit. And they're doing this through a very complex ecosystem of councils, multi-stakeholder platforms, and partnerships with governments and UN agencies. Now, it's these ecosystem actors who have frontal roles in the governance and the leadership of the summit. The message that's very clearly coming out of big agriculture, that they are basically rebranding themselves from climate deniers to problem solvers. They're basically talking about advantages in digital farming, precision agriculture, genetic engineering, and that all these will reduce the ecological footprint of agriculture. And this is the message that's coming from the ecosystem of actors that are frontally involved in the Food System Summit. No? So let's see, who are the most prominent actors? So the first is the World Economic Forum. Now this was, this located in Davos in Switzerland. It's a transnational organization of corporate, political, intellectual, and civil society leaders. 1,000 of the world's largest corporations are its foundation members. It was set up about 20 years over that, more than 20 years ago. And it in 2010, it launched the Global Redesign Initiative, which basically contains a comprehensive set of proposals for reshaping global governance, including the new vision for agriculture, which, for example, has been designed by very powerful transnational corporations to try to bring the fourth industrial revolution into agriculture and food, and bring food and agriculture into the fourth industrial revolution. So this sort of involves a re-engineering of the entire global food system. They have what they call 12 transforming technologies that use the next generation biotechnologies, precision farming, blockchains, and the Internet of Things, and so on, to manufacture genetically modified organisms. So, for example, there's a whole movement of, say, plant-based foods, which goes under the name of veganism, synthetic biology, which is synthetically produced meats, imitation meats, and so on. No? Now, the reshaping of global governance, which Stefano spoke very eloquently about, is rooted in this sort of corporate growth. It involves big data and so on. No? Now, okay, so that's the World Economic Forum. Now, then there's the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Now, this is an international, it's called CEO, the Chief Executive Officer, CEO-led business coalition of over 200 businesses and partners. This is an industry platform, and it is primarily responsible for the narrative of game-changing solutions in the UN Food Systems Summit. And they're also promoting this idea that you can solve climate change and environmental degradation that's coming from extractivism. You can solve that through game-changing solutions that can be profitable and should also be managed by corporations. So, they're basically part of this whole idea that businesses are not climate deniers, but that addressing the climate crisis can be profitable. So they are very influential, for example, in promoting the green economy, the blue economy, and new innovations, incentivizing market, all that language they use. Now, this World Business Council for Sustainable Development is very rich. Their companies and business sector, they have a combined revenue of over $8.5 trillion. They include over 70 national businesses and transnational businesses and so on. Now, they, along with the World Economic Forum, are taking a leadership role as chairpersons or members in many of the governing bodies of the Food Systems Summit. Then there's the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa, AGRA, which Michael has already talked about. It was founded in 2006 by the Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. It calls itself a non-governmental organization, but it really presents agribusiness interests. And, it has already provided more than $500 million in grants to adopt. It basically promotes green revolution technologies in Asia. Primarily hybrid seeds, synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and so on. It's also promoting, for example, public-private partnerships very heavily to sell agribusiness inputs to African farmers. And it's a very powerful lobbying platform for African governments to enact policy changes that basically prioritize seed and agrochemical companies. Also promoting patenting of seeds and weakening and regulations that protect against GMOs. So AGRA is very, very powerful and already has been talked about. The special envoy for the Food Systems Summit, Madame Agnes Kalibata, is the president of AGRA, and so on. And the Rockefeller Foundation, which is very influential in the post-summit actions, is a big financier, as is Bill Gates Foundations. Then there are a number of others that you may not have heard of so well. One is called the EAT Forum, EAT. It's an acronym. You can look it up online. And it consists of a forum, foundation, and a EAT Lancet Commission. They call themselves like a multi-stakeholder platform for sustainable healthy food systems and a sort of science-based global platform for food system science transformation through science and partnerships and so on. Now, again, businesses are heavily involved in it, and their science and innovation that they're really promoting here is basically trying to shift the world to a healthy, tasty, what they're saying, sustainable plant-based diet. Now, of course, there are many people in the world who don't eat meat, who are vegetarians and vegans, who actually do eat real plant-based diets, but the plant-based diets that each World or EAT Commission is promoting are also through synthetic biotechnology foods. They have a guideline for a planetary health diet, which they say will basically feed more than 10 billion people and so on by 2050. But then again, it requires sustainable, it requires agricultural intensification. Then there is a coalition called the Scaling Up of Nutrition, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative again in food and nutrition area. It was launched in 2010 with the IMF and the World Bank and the UN system. And basically it promotes sort of short-term medical and technical solutions, focusing on chronic undernutrition. They talk about nutrition-sensitive interventions, such as high-input intensive agriculture, biofortification, genetically modified crops, and so on. So India, for example, is now going through this whole mandatory fortification. SUN, Scaling Up Nutrition, is very, very influential in that. India is, in fact, one of the SUN's primary target countries. There's the Food and Land Use Coalition, which is another WEF, World Economic Forum invention. Then there's a Global Alliance to Improve Nutrition Gain, which is a Swiss foundation, again through Mobilize, which is a, they say they mobilize private investment and businesses to work on decreasing hunger and malnutrition and working on, working with governments to push policy changes towards nutritious diets. Again, GAIN is involved in India. If you look at the biofortification issues, GAIN has has been contributing to that. We have the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Global Alliance for the Future of Food. All these are corporate philanthropies and interconnected with each other. There's the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, which is an environmental NGO, and Care International. So these are the main ones, that are the main corporate ecosystem actors that are involved in the Food System Summit. So when we criticize the Food System Summit as a corporate-driven summit, the point isn't that Nestle or Cargill or Monsanto is right there up front orchestrating everything. It's much more complex than that, as I think Stefano pointed out, that there are layers and layers of influence peddling through this system that they call multi-stakeholderism. Many of you who are listening in today understand very well what multi-stakeholderism is. Basically, these are platforms which seek to bring anybody who has some kind of an interest in an issue together. And the argument that is made about multi-stakeholderism is that everybody is equal. Everybody has equal stakes, in creating in solving a problem. But of course, what is not recognized explicitly is the power imbalances and the power asymmetries in multi-stakeholderism. So, if it's a question of a large dam or a mining project, and you bring affected communities there along with the big corporation, the military, the government, give approvals, environmental NGOs, everybody's rights to those resources are not the same. And everybody's power to influence decision-making is not the same. But multi-stakeholderism, of course, doesn't recognize all that. So, these are, this is the operating process of the World, Food System Summit. Let me just talk about where we are now and resistance and oppositions. Now, when the partnership between the World Economic Forum and the UN was announced in 2019, many organizations got together and wrote a letter to the UN requesting a cancellation of this partnership, pointing out how a World Economic Forum, a corporate-led body, partnership with the UN actually really signals corporate capture of the UN system. We never got a response. Never got a dialogue, nothing. We've repeatedly sent that letter, no response. Then when the Food System Summit was announced, we again wrote, we meaning the whole bunch of people in the world who got together, and many of them are engaged, for example, in the Committee for World Food Security as part of the civil society and indigenous peoples mechanism. Wrote again to the UN, to the Deputy Secretary General and the Secretary General, and also to the head of the CFS and so on, saying, that this is wrong, what is happening. A food system summit really must come, through a multilateral process, etc. We didn't get a response. The only response to our letter was they said, well, why don't you join the Food System Summit? So we said, okay, we can join the Food System Summit if you allow us to add an extra action track. And this action track on corporate capture of food and corporate capture of food governance. Let us have that action track. We will coordinate, we will mobilize on it. It was not acknowledged. So we said that they refused. We said, okay, another condition that we have is declaration of conflicts of interest. So every group that is involved, all these corporate bodies, everybody who's involved in the science group, everybody, all the actors involved in the councils and the action tracks, declare where your funding comes from. Provide conflicts of interest statements, and be transparent about where you are. That was also not accepted. So then we said, okay, centralize human rights, make human rights central to the summit, so that it's not corporate interest, it's not high technology, it's not innovation, it's not business solutions. These are human rights. Food is multi-purpose, it's multifunctional, as Stefano and Michael have pointed out. And, so the right to food is dependent on the realization of so many other rights, and the violation of other rights violates the right to food. So given that, it's not just one human right, but it's the entire spectrum of human rights, individual and collective, not just individual rights, but the rights of people and communities. Centralize that throughout the conference, throughout the summit process. That was also not accepted, and so on. So we said, okay, so we then have no choice, we will boycott. And we prepared together a boycott letter, which was signed by over 500 groups. We organized academics, many academics and researchers and policymakers themselves that started to see the problems of the summit. So academics themselves joined us. They started creating, there's a number of critiques that are there that have been presented on the science basis of the summit, on the science days organized by the summit, and so on. And we formed what was called the People's Autonomous Response to the UN Food System Summit. And through that, we helped to coordinate the academic boycott of the summit and the criticisms and critiques of the different academics and policymakers. We prepared policy and briefing papers for governments, popular education materials. We reached out to media and press. We had regional meetings across all the continents, creating awareness about the Food System Summit and corporate capture and so on. And finally, all these culminated from July 25th to 28th to the People's Counter Mobilization to Transform Corporate Food Systems. Because right now, the situation that we are in is that there are now a raft of resignations that are happening. So a number of people who have been involved inside the Food System Summit in different action tracks have offered their resignation, have stepped out because they're saying that the process is non-transparent. The corporate capture is really, really terrible. In fact, people who have been, who were involved in the pre-summit have pointed out that the pre-summit itself was actually not at all inclusive and broad. It basically included sessions with representatives of international food companies and organizations that represented tobacco, alcohol, food industries. And it was pretty much dominated by the organizers of the World Economic Forum in Davos and other industry representatives. And when they took the stage at the pre-summit, these corporate representatives of these different corporate interests, they basically put into doubt the idea of healthy diets And they basically felt that, nutrition is a personal choice. It's a question of freedom. And the role of corporations is to put the products out in the market and educate the public and let the public decide what they want to eat. And very few public health advocates were given the floor, just a handful of even health ministries and representatives of smaller countries. And, so as Michael was saying earlier, it's very confusing. What is the role of governments? What is the role of public health ministries? No? Who actually gets to make any decisions in the summit? So when we look at the situation now, the current status, no? Our fears, meaning the fears of all of us who are opposing the Food System Summit, and the academics and the researchers and many governments, our fears are founded that these Food System Summit structures are here to stay. They will carry on after the summit day. Many of us had been warning that this summit, it's not the summit the day that's important. It's not even the fact that, it's not even the fact that they've had a pre-summit or a post-summit or those. What is important is how they have used the umbrella of the United Nations, the umbrella of the highest office of the United Nations, the Secretary General's office, the umbrellas of all the different UN agencies, Food and Agriculture Organization, UNICEF, IFAD, and so on. How they've used this multilateral system basically to bring in corporate agendas, the agendas of corporations. And now we are seeing the agendas of corporations, not only just the agri-food, agrochemical corporations, but those corporations combining with digital corporations, those that are working on high technology innovation and so on. And so the last 18 months of organizing have been about all these groups coming together under the banner of the United Nations, getting the legitimacy of the United Nations and moving into national spaces and changing the narrative, which Stefano talked about, basically capturing the narrative of what is needed for food systems. Now, we've seen what happened with COVID-19. We've seen what happened with the climate crisis. There is all this language on the UN Food Systems website on the importance of transformation and the fragility of food systems and so on. But the transformation that they're talking about is not the transformation of the global system of chains and global system of intellectual property rights protection and technologies. They're talking about changing national food systems to connect them to global value chains. So that's the narrative that's being, socialized. Now, the game-changing solution, so-called this game-changing solution, is very big in Food System Summit. These are basically expensive techno fixes. They pander to corporate control and profits. They're basically patent-protected technologies, digital technologies and platforms, the use of data to predict and control production, consumption, consumer demands. There's a lot of biotechnology being promoted, gene-edited seeds, genetically modified organisms, other techno fixes. And the nature positive solutions, they're talking about sustainable intensification with pesticides, agrochemicals, precision farming, and so on, again, bringing biotechnology into it. For nutrition, they're talking about ultra processing, food fortification, biofortification. So basically food and nutrition are becoming confused with products, and food and nutrition are becoming confused with medicine. They're mixing the two up, which is extremely dangerous. Climate change, there's more and more linkages between climate change, of course, and food. And they are promoting these market approaches to climate change, offset markets, net zero, climate smart agriculture, blue economy, green economy, and so on and so forth. More multi-stakeholderism. A very important issue here is that the idea of how to govern food systems is being taken away from public scrutiny. So more and more, the idea is that you direct public resources towards public-private partnerships. But at the same time, these public-private partnerships will be multi-stakeholders. So if they're multi-stakeholder initiatives, then they're not governed by governments per se. It's also very important to keep in mind that this is a year when the World Trade Organization is going to have its ministerial meeting, I think the 12th in November, December. This is also a year when the there's a conference of parties, the climate COP, which is going to happen in Glasgow. And the summit is linking with these. The summit is linking with these. They are the very strong push from the summit is on definitely on patent protected technologies, so intellectual property rights and so on, and climate friendly solutions for food, which I already mentioned. And the last thing I just want to say, why is this important for India? Why is this important at the national level? Because eventually all this global multi-stakeholder blah, blah has to be implemented somewhere. And this somewhere where it's going to be implemented will be in our countries and in our regions. Because they basically need us, they need people to buy those products. They need to convince farmers and fishers to buy their seeds. They need to have governments basically promoting their technologies and taking subsidies and supports away from small-scale food producers, taking subsidies and supports away from workers, changing regulation so you can have more workers working for corporations and for food processing, companies rather than doing their own production. So they need the support of governments for policies and regulation, and for being able to give corporations more and more power. They need us as consumers. They need more and more people to be using their technologies and their foods and so on. And for that, they have also created, in fact, UNDP, Food and Agriculture Organization, UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, World Economic Forum, and EAT have created what they call the Future of Food Systems Collaboration, where the primary initiative, they want to continue country-level dialogues to further these post-summit outcomes, to build what they're saying that, multi-stakeholderism is not just about bringing people to the table, it's about changing hearts and minds, getting people to think differently, and so on. So these things are going to be implemented very much in our countries. And that's really the key here. In terms of what are the outcomes, what are the goals? What is it that the food system wants to achieve? I think, well, a big part of it is what, Stefano already mentioned that this, the Food System Summit, in my view, is the most dangerously perfect example of corporate-led multi-stakeholderism. And I'm saying dangerously perfect, but it's dangerous because of the way it's moving global governance and decision-making. And I'm saying, and I say perfect because there are so much what we call smoke and mirrors. It's like a magician's act. It's almost like when, the idea of derivatives was first introduced in financial markets, bankers, everybody was scratching their head. What is a derivative? What is a derivative? Eventually they started being used, derivatives started being used. But even now, you ask a banker to explain what is a derivative, really, they can't really explain, And I think this is one of the things with this kind of multi-stakeholderism, that the arguments that they make are that everybody needs to work together to come to a solution. That's true. But then when you're examining a problem, you have to analyze its root causes and its structural causes. You cannot actually address a problem in the long term or a crisis in the long term if we don't actually look at its roots and structural causes. So what's happening in the Food System Summit, as Michael also pointed out, is that roots and structural causes are not being addressed at all. So it's a completely ahistorical view. It's like the world is starting now. The world is starting now. And we have, by 2015, we'll have so many people, this will be hungry, that will be hungry. So it's saying, look from now to the future, but don't look at what's happened in the past. But not looking at what has created the crisis, what has destroyed food systems, what has caused COVID, why who are the most vulnerable and people in COVID, right? So not looking at those, for example, basically also undermines the development of solutions that actually addresses the structures of exploitation. Just moving forward with uncritically. So that, I think that's one big challenge of it. No. Now, in terms of the coalitions of action, the coalitions of actions were supposed to come from action tracks. Now, it's kind of Michael did explain the structure of the Food System Summit, but it takes too much time to explain how the action tracks work and so on. Now, some coalitions for action, like the Coalition of Action on Agroecology or on Nature Positive, has actually come from proper debate inside. But there's a coalition of action, for example, on implementation, means of implementation, that is just suddenly announced out of the blue. How it was developed, nobody knows. And in fact, the chair of the governance group, Dr. Buckley, has resigned in protest. The chair of that action, she resigned in protest because she said that, we've been trying to actually build a proper system, of people working on issues of governance, and that was all completely ignored. And the means of implementation coalition of action now just basically has finance, innovation, data. And basically they're bringing in some human rights issues. It includes, it ignores gender, indigenous peoples, etc. So how these coalitions of action will work is unclear. But basically what's happening is that there are no negotiated agreements there. There are no negotiated agreements between governments, like what happens in multilateral fora. So a number of solutions, game-changing solutions, are developed by different companies and whatever, NGOs working together, they're put on the table. And whichever one gets the most amount of financing gets picked up. Whoever says, if some corporations and NGOs say, oh, we form an alliance together and we pick this up, we'll do digital land use or, whatever, a digitalization of agricultural records. Whatever that is picked up can move forward. And if more and more money is going towards these multi-stakeholder platforms, basically that means that public resources are being diverted from, policies that should be public interest related policies to these corporate multi-stakeholder solutions. And so governments, how will they finance public programs? How will they, if school meals are going to be financed, for example, through a multi-stakeholder dialogue or through a multi-stakeholder initiative? Where is the public there? Where are the affected people there? So, this whole, I think that one thing that's very important for us at the national and at local levels to really watch out for is how this kind of multi-stakeholderism is being operationalized through these coalitions of action and through different platforms, and what's going to be their impact on public interest, on public goods and services. And how will that affect distribution? How will that affect the PDS? How will that affect employment? How will that affect people's rights and so on? If we all join hands together, then we can definitely mount a coordinated front against corporate capture. And I think it's actually very good that there are so many different mobilizations happening, because it shows that it's not just one tendency, that's opposing. Because, it's very easy for governments or very easy for corporations to say, oh, it's just this group, this non-constructive group, or that non-constructive group, oh, they're anti-farmer, oh, they're anti-poor, they're anti-fisher. It's very easy to say that about one group. But if many groups around the world are organizing independently, autonomously, these mobilizations, these resistances, it shows that people around the world have said, look, enough is enough. And I think and I also think that one of the reasons this is happening is that we are in the middle of COVID. We've been in the middle of COVID since the last year and a half, almost 2 years. We've seen the collapse of these global chains. We have seen who really fed and housed people. We have seen the impacts of privatization and trade liberalization on workers. We've seen what's happened to migrant workers. We've seen how inhuman and dehumanized this sort of economic financial globalization has been. We've seen how financing completely stopped and countries after countries started collapsing. We've seen how governments, even in the so-called build back better that the UN Secretary General is saying, post-COVID build up, how basically the policies and the programs the governments are bringing in are all pro-corporate. They're not pro-worker, they're not pro-small-scale food producers, they're not pro-fisher, they're not pro-indigenous people, they're not even pro-women. Even the care economy is being monetized. So we've seen that basically corporations have spread their tentacles so deeply into our economies and finance that it will really take a big shake-up, a big turnaround. So I think people are becoming more and more aware of that. So the science group is supposed to be, the way they said is, it was supposed to be what's the word for it? Provide a robust, knowledge-based, evidence-based foundation to the entire science, to the entire summit. And it's chaired by Mr. Joachim von Braun, who is very influential. You can Google him, or people use Google, from Germany. And then the other members are about 27 so-called experts who are in high-level teaching positions or policy positions. But most of the science group was handpicked by the leadership in the summit, which is primarily, as I explained, from the corporate ecosystem. These are people who are amenable to what they call game-changing solutions and new technologies, the gene-edited seeds, the digital data-driven technologies, precision farming, carbon offsets, global commodity markets, and so on. And the argument that they make is that the scientific group appears to, is multidisciplinary and it's from all over the world. But actually, if you actually look at the bios, if you go online and look at the biographies of these scientists, of these so-called science group people, they are all from overlapping elite institutional formations, which basically champion the Green Revolution. So it's Green Revolution technologies, free trade policies, not only through the free trade agreements, but primarily through the World Trade Organization, and support the kinds of solutions that are being pushed by the consortium of the OECD, which is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. So this is a very elite group. And in fact, I'm just going through my notes, excuse me for being so informal, but many academics and researchers have basically presented very strong criticisms of the science group. Let me just name a few. They say that the science group's practices actually impoverish the scientific basis of the summit. It's serving as a gatekeeper for determining the boundaries of what is science. It completely eliminates, ignores, shuts out people's science on agroecology, people's innovations of seeds, people's solutions, and so on. Science, technology, and innovation, it sort of decontextualizes, uproots them from their political, economic, social conditions. It's basically promoting biotechnology, big data, global value chains as the solutions to all food and agricultural problems. And they're using sort of this multicultural digital inclusion to promote people. They're saying that multicultural digitalization is the way people from all over the world will be able to come together. But it completely sort of ignores indigenous and agroecological knowledge and so on. And they're basically saying that, and these are very, very well-known academics. And if you go to that website that I put, there's a whole set of academic papers there, that, basically industry perspectives are being promoted as visionary. But the perspectives of small-scale food producers, social movements, indigenous peoples are being basically presented as backward. The message that I have is that I think, in India and also in Asia, we have so many food systems. We have so many diverse food systems. And these food systems are not made by corporations. These food systems are made by people in community. And these, many of them, and they're all scientific. In India, in South Asia and Southeast Asia, also across Asia, in fact, we've had a very strong tradition of publicly supported, publicly financed research and scientific systems, academic institutions and so on. Now, increasingly over the last 10, 20 years, we have seen these being taken over by corporations, and that's extremely dangerous. And to be against corporate science, to be against corporate-backed science, elite science, is not to be anti-technology. To be against intellectual property rights that are owned by corporations is not to be anti-farmer. Farmers have been saving their seeds for years. To be anti-patent protected technologies or IPRs is not to be anti-technology or anti-innovation, not at all. In fact, to be against corporate trade is not to be anti-trade. To be against the World Trade Organization is not being anti-trade or anti-investment. In fact, more and more we need public investment. We need strong public investment, which can be publicly monitored, democratically monitored, where people need to be involved more. The whole idea, it's really democratizing it, not from a top-down way, but through a participatory democratizing process.